Okay. I've never done this. Well, I've done this. I've taken a transmission off a B series. I've done many of these, but I have never taken a B series transmission apart. And I'm gonna try to do that today. So I'm gonna film me tearing this thing down, and I'm also gonna film me installing a very nice and very expensive limited slip differential into this transmission. And here is the LSD that I'll be installing. What the hell is this thing? This is a terrible idea. It's probably gonna be fun. I mean, look at it. Oh my God. So let's just be real. I was on eBay and I was like, man, what LSDs are available? I put an OBX LSD in my Datsun back in the day, and I resorted it with new Bellevue washers and some ARP hardware in my R200 diff, and it did really well. Like, never broke, never had a problem out of it. So I was like, maybe there's an OBX equivalent for the CRX. Well, there is, but it's like $500-600. But this thing pops up and it's like 20 or 30 bucks. And there's only one link. Like, every description is just some guy in a garage, and it's him like hammering this thing into a diff, and there's no follow-up of like, does it work or doesn't it work? How does it work? So I'm gonna figure that out. Just throw caution to the tornado. For this teardown, I'm referencing a thread on Honda Tech when forums were alive and awesome, and now it's just Facebook and idiots like me on YouTube. Honda Bull was his screen name. The thread is from 2008, but it's a very well-documented thread. It shows all the bolt hole locations, everything that you're gonna need to tear down, and that is what I'm using as an instruction manual for the first time I've ever torn one of these down. So hopefully this goes well. And I also had somebody comment, well, I was going back and forth with someone in comments and say, the YouTube channel is like clapped out, where all you do is just film stuff and post it without any over-the-top editing. Don't typically do well. So I'm not going to change the production value of our show. That sucks. So I'm going to just continue to do stuff, film it, and post it, and hopefully we can break, maybe 12,000 subscribers in the next 6 to 8 years. That'd be cool. Either way, welcome to the show. Let's tear this pile down and get going. I also see why people don't watch me, because I say stuff like, get going, and it's crazy. I don't know. I wouldn't watch my show. I shouldn't say my show, Ryan will get upset. Our show. First thing is these two 12mm bolts that hold the shift fork springs. Those come out, and there's going to be springs behind them. Take care when you loosen these that you don't lose the springs. You have to be very careful. Never done this before. There's the spring. Look at it. Cool. There's one. Oh God, don't lose the spring, dude. And then two. The spring, don't lose it. Set that down. Cool. Then you're gonna hit this reverse idler shaft bolt, a 14mm on the back side of the trans. Actually, I shouldn't say back side, it's top side if you have the trans in the car still. Ooh. Oh, no, almost dropped it. God in heaven, this is so terrible. I hate doing stuff for the first time on camera, unless I'm in college. Now we gotta take this thing out. It's just a 1/2 inch. It's probably in my toolbox. It's just the head of a 1/2 inch ratchet to take that out. And I'm guessing that it's gonna be easy to do on camera. So I'm gonna pop that off camera for a sec. Okay, so this comes out. And then inside there, you're gonna see, I'm guessing, I have no idea what I'm looking at here. Well, clearly that's gotta come off. So hold on. So this C-clip is inside of a groove in the countershaft bearing, and you have to spread these two tabs. Let me get something to point with. I wish I had Rye's penis here. It's small enough to get in there. You have to spread these two tabs, if this will focus. These two tabs, this and this, have to get spread apart and then lifted above this actual countershaft bearing and above that groove. So snap ring pliers, needle nose pliers, either way, whatever you can do to get in there and spread it and pick it up. I'm gonna do that real quick and show you the aftermath. It's a little tough to tell, but when you spread those apart, the actual counter shaft will sink down. So you literally just open those up and this thing's gonna drop. Now I'm gonna go ahead and take off all of these remaining 12mm bolts. I think there's 17 or so total. So all these 12mm bolts around the outside edge of the case need to come apart, come off. Okay, so once you have all of the case bolts out, or bell housing bolts, whatever you want to call them, you're going to pry between the bell housing itself and the transmission case. It's a pain in the ass. There's a couple of provisions for pry. There's over here you can see a little area. You can find a little dip over here, but it's going to be a little bit of working, so don't get frustrated and do not take like a hammer and a screwdriver and try to separate them, because you can actually chip and damage the case. And this has to be sealed to keep fluid out, so you'll have to reseal this. And if you have a giant divot out of your aluminum, it's gonna be harder for it to seal. The first 2 bolts I took out, the 14mm shift spring, whatever the hell, they're 14 mils, they have springs on the end. These balls, these metal ball bearings actually sit behind the springs. The Honda Tech article has, for whatever reason, these are blurred out. Like you can't, I don't know what happened, like got taken over by internet brands and they bricked out balls. I'm guessing they thought it was a cuss word. But these balls go with these 2 spring-loaded actions right there. So do not lose these. Be very careful that you save those. You'll need those. Next, you're gonna see these 10mm bolts that house the shift change assembly. There's 1, 2, 3 down there, and then 4 and 5. Those get pulled off. You're gonna need a deep well and a thin wall socket for some of these, like a 1/4-inch socket, probably get in there just fine. You're gonna pull all those out. The 2 assemblies that are pulled out, I always put the bolts back in the holes that they came from. These will slide out pretty simply. You can see, pull this up, so that, set this down here for just a second. This pin right here, you see it slides up and down. Well, if I can get a better shot of it, up and down. That will locate itself within these shift rods right here. So that's where that goes, right in yonder. And then this piece will literally just come off the back here really easily. It just slips right out. Set it aside and then roll on to the next step. Next step. Tenacious D reference. So the next thing you gotta do is you gotta literally pull the main shaft and counter shaft assembly straight up and out. I'm gonna do this on the floor so I don't lose anything. This isn't held on with anything. I just experienced this a second ago. I went to pull up on just this top bearing just because I'm an idiot. And if you pull this bearing off, you'll see there's an inner race, not inside there, but the inner race that sits inside here. And that inner race actually came up and off. All this stuff came up and off. So what I did was I took a ton of pictures also before I started tearing this down. And all I had to do was go back to my pictures and just make sure, because this thing was sitting up high, because this inner race was protruding out. It wasn't resting inside the actual bearing here. So looking at my pictures, I'm like, well, I know something's not right. You can see the locator tabs. I relocated it, set the race back in, bearing goes back on the top, and we're good. So always, always, always take a ton of pictures before you start tearing something down for the first time, because I can promise you, you'll reference them later. Woo, I'm not gonna lie, this was the most nerve-wracking part for me. Because when you go to pull, obviously this is the top side that I just showed you, that bearing, and the shift forks. When you go to pull it all out, since there's no lock nut or anything on this, things just want to fall wherever. So be very careful. I grabbed towards the base of this shaft and pulled, base of the shaft, pulled straight out. There's a couple, looks like thrust or crush washers. These didn't come off with it, so make sure you find these if they fell out or wherever. They didn't fall out of my trans, they just stayed stuck. But just keep an eye on that. And now I have access to ring gear and differential, which is what I'm after. So I put the trans back up top, shaft's down yonder. Now differential is a very difficult part to remove. With everything else removed, this is the most in-depth step. You have to put your thumb in the hole real deep, and then you just pull it out. And that's your differential. That's how difficult it is. So real hard. And the differential out, you're gonna see this pin that passes through the center of it if you have an open diff. Well, that pin goes through the whole thing and it's held in with this little additional retention pin here. See that? So when you flip it over to the other side, you can see a little sight hole, or not even a pass through rather, on the other side of that pin that you can knock through and get that pin pushed out. So you're gonna have to knock that through to get that center pin that goes between the gear set. You gotta get that out. So knock that pin, a little punch. So far, this has been the hardest part to get this pin out. I ended up taking an Allen key and cutting it down because I don't have a punch that's that small. And you can see it's starting to back out. Let me get over here. See, it's starting to back out right there. So continue to work on it, just work it out. And that's the pin, and it comes all the way out. If I can get it to focus. So pop it out the back, and you're good to go on the pin side of things. Don't lose it, keep it, even though it's a piece of junk and you hate it and it treated you so wrong. Okay, so pin is out. The small pin that holds this bar in is out. Now you can take this bar and you can literally just push it out with your fingers. It's not in there very tightly. See it start to move. Also, you can see there is a sight hole, well, not a sight hole, but a pass through that pin passes through the housing and then also through that retention pin. So make sure not to lose that. Well, not to lose it, but to make sure to line it up when you go back together. Pull that sucker out. And there she goes. Pin is out, which now loosens up all of these gears. So you can check them out, make sure everything looks good and happy. They do, they look fine. Everything looks great. So good, this is a great idea. So with the pin out, the big pin and the retention pin, these Bellevue, I don't know what they're called, Bellevue washers, but these washers actually sit behind this hole right here. These will come out, you gotta make sure these go back in. But I have already taken the limited slip differential and I have slid it in between those gears. So if you look through here, there's a pass through. Once I line all the holes up, the pin will go back through that. And once the pin's through that and you put the retention clip or pin back in, the washers and everything, all you're gonna do is pop these retainers off and it'll spread this block apart, locking the passenger and driver side together a little bit better than how it was before. So this is a little bit of a pain in the butt. I've talked about a video earlier. It's actually a really informative video, and he goes through assembling one of these on a bench, just this part, and he doesn't have the transmission teardown. And I'll put a link to that video in the description as well, so you can check out his video. It is much better than mine in terms of getting this thing installed and put together. So you can see I have my pin set, I have the washer in on this side, I have the LSD, LOL, installed there. The problem is though, this LSD, I dropped a washer on that side, but this LSD, the pass-through hole for this pin is not big enough. Like some of the nicer, I hate to say there's nicer versions of this piece of shit, but there's nicer versions of it, I guess. So what I'm gonna attempt to do is line everything up, pop that retention clip off each side and see if this spreads wide enough to fit that pin through, which could be a huge mistake because those springs are extremely strong, and if it doesn't work, I have absolutely no idea how I'm gonna get it back out. I'm gonna have to hammer it home, I guess. I got no clue. This could be a terrible idea, we'll see. Okay, can confirm, terrible idea. So this thing is now wedged in there. I'm gonna try to hammer this thing so it actually lines up, and we'll see what happens. But I have to do this off camera because there's gonna be a lot of cussing involved. Okay, so I was able to wedge a screwdriver between the gear and the block, and that pressed these blocks back together, and I could get the retention stuff back on. So that's nice, get that out of the way. It doesn't solve the problem of this pass-through not being wide enough for this pin at rest. The springs have a ton of tension and a ton of growth in them. And in a lot of the other tutorials, you see people grinding gears down to make this stuff fit. So let me pop these gears back out. They just fall out, honestly. You can see I've already ground this top gear down. What I'm gonna do now is grind the bottom gear down as well to offset the distance. And then that way we can get a nice, hopefully a nice spread to allow this pin to fall through. All right, round two. So the LSD, I can't even call it an LSD. The LSD block is in. The bottom gear and the top gear have been ground down as flat as I could. I mean, they're probably fine. And now I have a good bit of distance, I think, for this thing to separate and allow the pass through. What I was getting at earlier, if you couldn't tell, is that hole is too small to fit this pin. So I literally have to open this thing up. When you pop these like retention tabs off the ends, they fly out because they're under a ton of tension. And that thing has to spread open. And when it spreads open, hopefully it'll have enough distance to fit that pin through it this time. And if it doesn't, I'm just gonna find a dumpster and I'm gonna throw it in the dumpster because that's what I'm about. Just giving up immediately. Okay, so can confirm. It's in there. It has opened up just enough to fit the pin through so I can lock both sides. What you'll have to do is I put it up in a vise and I literally just take my ball peen and an extension and I tap the edge of this block until it centers up. And I gotta pass through the other side, but I do not wanna forget to line up the washer on this side before I pass the pin all the way through. And there you go. So I still have to put the retention pin back in, but you can see spread between the gears. Now it's locking both sides as best it can. We'll see how it does. This is more for science than it is for performance because I can't imagine a $35 piece of metal with some springs is gonna perform as well as like an M Factory or a Quafe LSD. So I gotta get this thing back together and then I'm gonna reassemble the transmission, which that'll be fun. I have never done that, so I'm probably gonna just wing it, put it in the car and see what happens. Differential goes back in, one-handed, very heavy, so strong. Well, my forearms are strong from a lot of milking. I've done a lot of cow milking. Sliding the main shaft and counter shaft back in is the biggest pain in the ass so far. Obviously, diff just drops right in. The shift forks, the actual shift selector rods, have to be in their specific locations before you drop the assembly in, or you can stand these two assemblies up and cock them a little bit, and then you can feed each hole the respective rod that it needs. Man, I'm on one. Feed each hole the respective rod it needs. But didn't get any footage of that because it is a giant pain in the ass, but that's on. Everything is sunk in. We're looking good. And now I get to reinstall these little shift selector brackets on both sides. But so far so good. Ended up having to take this whole thing back down because this bearing was sitting too far up. So I ended up pulling factory service manual for order of all these components and redoing it. And now I have all my gears engaging properly. I need to clean this surface. You can tell I'm not like as peppy and happy as I was in the beginning of the video because this thing's murdered, absolutely murdered me. I'm gonna clean this, reseal it, and then put the case back on. But the next clip is gonna be the transmission's back together and it's ready to go in. So once you get to this point, you literally reassemble it in the order in which you took it apart with these components that we took out earlier, all those 12 mils, a couple 14s, so on and so forth. And gonna get this thing ready to drop back in the car. Okay. That sucked so hard. The one piece of advice I have for you if you're gonna do this, and it sucks because I don't do this. This is the first time I've ever done this. I'm sure if you do this a bunch or if you have you do them on a frequent basis, they get easier and easier. However, if you do this yourself and it's the first time you've done it, the best piece of advice I have for you, first and foremost, follow that tutorial on pulling the transmission apart that I mentioned earlier. I'll put the link in the description. And then number two, when you go to reassemble this thing, and this is in that tutorial, before you even spread any RTV or Honda Bond or whatever between the two case halves, test fit the bell to the case. So put this on and off a couple times until you know that it's in good shape and it'll go right on. I ruined 2 different times I spread FIPG or Honda Bond on there and I couldn't get the case to seat because it was stupid issues here and there. But when I finally got it, very, very exciting, obviously. But before you do any of that stuff, like I said, before you spread any Honda Bond, make sure you test fit these pieces together. Now, I am going to cut the camera off end this episode and take this and shove it in here with, I don't know where it is. There's a competition clutch somewhere around here. I am toaster strudeled. I'm going to finish this turdlet and get back in action. Thank you guys so much for watching. Any questions, don't ask me, because honestly, I'm the last person that should be answering them. Have a blessed day.